net present value, which takes a string of future payments and discounts them all to the present. And the net present value says just add all those up, and that gives you the present value of that future stream of payments as if you were to receive it today and cash them out periodically at different intervals in the future. Right? And so what you'll notice is that basically what we've done is we've created a bond, right? If you have a bunch of future payments, you know, $50 in a year, $50 in 2 years, $50 in 3 years, that's basically what a bond does for you. And the only difference between, just a string of payments like $50 each year versus a bond is that at the end of a bond's lifespan, you get a lump sum payment. Typically, it's $1,000, right? But that's all. That's the only difference between net present value of, future payments versus net present value for a bond. So what we're going to do, we're going to talk about basic bond definitions, and then we'll move into the actual pricing of bonds. So a bond is a debt instrument that is issued by companies. And the bonds will typically pay some interest rate over the course of several years, and then the company will pay one final interest payment and a principal payment back to the people who purchased the bonds. Okay, so there's lots and lots of different types of bonds, right? So you can have something called a callable bond, which is where if the company wants to, they can basically call the bond, which says, I'm going to buy this bond back from you whenever I want. So a callable bond has a different value than a non-callable bond. You can also have bonds that are tied to a stock investment. So as the price of the stock fluctuates, it's going to cause the price of the bond to fluctuate because you can convert from one to the other. It's called a convertible bond, where every bond is worth X number of shares, right? So that means that the price of the stock is going to influence the price of the bond. So there's all kinds of crazy variations on different types of bonds that you can create. But we're going to focus on the most basic types of bonds, which are, so our bonds are going to have a fixed duration. So the company can't call them and repay them early. Okay. They're going to have a fixed interest payment. A lot of bonds don't have a fixed interest payment. It can vary depending on all kinds of different factors. So many of them are tied to something called LIBOR. LIBOR is the rate at which banks lend to each other. And so as the LIBOR fluctuates, it changes the interest rate on a lot of bonds. But ours, we're going to assume that they're fixed interest payments. We're going to assume that they occur at regular intervals. And we're going to assume that they're not tied to any other asset. Just like we mentioned, some of them are actually tied to stock so that you can convert from bonds to stock if you want to. So if the stock goes off to the moon and the stock's worth a lot of money, you can convert your bonds into stock and make a whole lot of money on the shares. So these are not tied to any other asset.
May I ask a question regarding the fixed interest payment? Would these payments occur, let's say, annually or at the end of the period? Yeah,
it's typically multiple payments per year. So a lot of bonds are 2 payments per year.
Okay.
Yeah. And then they'll only be interest payments, and then all of the principal that the company borrowed at the beginning gets paid back at the end.
Okay.
And this is as opposed to an installment loan, where in an installment loan you pay off a little bit of principal as you go. In a bond, they borrow it at the beginning and they repay it at the end, and they pay interest payments at the end.
Okay.
Can you elaborate what that not tied to any other asset really means?
Yeah, so the example I was giving was if it's convertible into stock, then the price of the stock of the company is going to affect the value of the bond.
It could go up or it could go down.
Exactly, yeah. So we're going to write down some definitions that are describing all the different features that we see with bonds. So par value is what the bond is sold for initially. And many of them are $1,000 par value. So if they want to raise $1 million, they sell, what, 1,000 of these $1,000 bonds, right?
Million divided by 1,000.
Yep. I had to think about that for a second.
Got 3 zeros.
Yeah, that's the way I did it in my head as well. So the par value is what the bond will be redeemed for.
Wait, they're both par values?
Mm-hmm. Think of it as just like the value that's written on the bond. That's all
right,
par
okay.
is, yeah. So the coupon is the interest rate that determines how much interest will be paid. And I absolutely love this story about why the coupon is called the coupon. It's called the coupon because back in the olden days, a bond would have a certificate, and then attached to that certificate would be a whole bunch of coupons. And you literally clicked off a coupon and you took it into a bank, and they give you your interest. And now, of course, it's all electronic. But yeah, if you Google bond, coupon, then it'll show you what some of those look like. I thought that was pretty interesting. So the coupon's just the rate that determines how much interest is going to be paid. Current yield, this is a term that you'll see tossed around, but it's not really that useful. So current yield just says the interest divided by the market price.
What is the market price?
Whatever it's being bought and sold for on the open market. So these bonds are typically traded amongst investors, and they don't always trade at 1,000. Yeah.
Sir, on the interest, what units is that going to be? Is that going to be the remaining interest, or is that going to be the interest per month, or a unit attached to that interest?
This is the amount of the interest payment. Yeah. So if it's a 5% coupon and it's a $1,000 bond, each coupon payment is going to be $50. So this interest, whenever you say interest,
So
that's
this is the interest each payment.
that's right.
Okay, thank you.
And it's fixed, right? Can't you?
Yeah, for these bonds. It's fixed.
So these are pretty no frills bonds,
Exactly.
generic XYZ company.
Yep.
Okay.
What does the bottom say? Market price. Market price.
Oh. So the more relevant rate that you actually care about is actually the yield to maturity. yield to maturity consists of two components. We're going to talk about these today. But first of all, you get yield from the future interest payments. And this is always positive.
Unless something's really weird.
No, this one actually is always positive. But you also get yield due to price appreciation or depreciation. Of the bond at maturity. So if you buy a $1,000 bond at 800, it's going to repay you $1,000 when it matures. So you get interest payments, but then on top of that, you also get a change of $200 from the time you bought it to the time that it matures. And that extra $200, that's a positive, that's contributing positively to the yield that you're getting, because you're getting that gain of $200. But this can have a negative effect on the yield as well, because if you buy a bond for $1,100 that's going to mature at $1,000, you're actually losing $100 in principal because you're only getting paid $1,000 back. So this yield, due to price appreciation or depreciation, can be positive or negative.
So when you talk about buying this $1,000 bond for $1,100 or $800, you're talking about buying it on the open market.
That's right.
If you bought it at the time of issue, it would be $1,000.
That's right, exactly.
So it harkens back to the market price that we use for current yields.
It does, exactly.
So if you need, let's say, cash, then we would go and ask somebody to buy a bond, maybe you lower the price a little bit.
That's exactly
It
what
would
happens.
take a small loss, but you would get the cash.
Exactly.
There's ones like in countries with crazy currency values like Argentina or
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So, what it really means is that then bond loses the value,
Sometimes.
just like the stocks? Is that what do you mean by negative
Yep.
yield?
Exactly, yeah. If you buy on the open market, with the given market price, if you're buying at 1,100, it will actually lose value over time. There's a great illustration of this in the reader.
Graph goes down, and it goes.
Yeah, exactly. So,
Goes up or down.
these two lines here, these have a fixed yield, a fixed yield to maturity. So that's what we're talking about here. So for a fixed yield to maturity, you can expect the price to slowly increase up to par as time goes on, or you can expect the price to decrease down to par as time goes on. Where basically what happens is, if the price stayed at the same rate, suppose that it's at 700 right now, as time goes on, you're going to be locking in more and more yield because, suppose it stays at around 700 all the way up until year 14, then you're going to gain $300 in 1 year. So you've got an astronomical yield at that point, right? So that's not going to happen because people are going to trade and they're going to affect the price. So if the price stayed low, the yield would start to pick up, people would start to buy. They buy until the yield gets more in line with what it should be. So as time goes on, people sort of trade, and it's going to roughly stay, assuming that nothing changes with the company, it'll roughly stay at that same yield over time, which means the price has to slowly appreciate.
But if the company goes bankrupt at year 10,
Or
before you get to the end,
is the guarantee, it's
you just
guaranteed by
you bought it.
somebody, right? These bonds are guaranteed.
No, not always,
They're
yeah.
unsecured, there's no asset side, so.
Yeah, so bonds are what are called senior securities, which means that in a bankruptcy liquidation, they get their money back first, and then comes like preferred stock investments, then come common stock investments. So they're sort of first in line for any assets of the company if it files for bankruptcy. But it's certainly not guaranteed. There's plenty of cases where they won't get anything, yeah. All right, good. So those are the basic definitions. Any questions on this so far? I know it's a lot of definitions to take in all at once, but I'll reiterate them as we go. So bond valuation. Says nothing more than for an end-year annual coupon bond at a given hurdle rate, what price should I pay for the bond today? For an end-year annual coupon bond. And I guess we should say with par value given by par at a given hurdle rate. What price should I pay? So let's introduce some variables. Any questions on what we're going for here? So we've got an interest payment. Given by I. So it's 5% coupon, $1,000 par value. You get $50 per payment. We're going to use the variable price for the variable price. R is going to be our hurdle rate. Par is going to be the par value. And N is the duration, the number of years. And so what we have, just like we talked about last week, we have a string of future payments. We're getting interest payment I, interest payment I, interest payment I, and we're going to get that for N years. And also in the N year, we're also going to get a par payment. So that's the value that's written into the contract of the bond. It's $1,000 face value.
So we get the last interest and the par.
Yeah, these occur on in the same year, same payment. And we want to know, we've got this future string of payments, we want to know, what is it worth to me today? So this payment's going to occur in 1 year, so it's discounted at a rate of 1 plus R to the 1. This payment, it's a payment that's happening 2 years from now, so it's discounted at 1 plus R to the 2. 1 plus R to the 3, and we're adding all these up. This occurs in the nth year, and this payment also occurs in the nth year. So bondage in Do you guys have any questions about discounting? Okay, good.
What's the last one? Present value?
Par,
Top.
yeah, the face value of the bond,
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
gonna be, yep. And so what we notice is, okay, we've got this value I that's common to all these terms, we can factor that out. And then this sequence here that we're seeing, it has very familiar form, right? We've got this thing to the first, that same thing to the second, that same thing to the third, to the fourth, and we're adding higher and higher powers of a fixed.
And you call that a,
Exactly, yep. So we're actually going to make a substitution where we'll do exactly that. Making that substitution, we get this very clean expression. It was clean until I scribbled that out.
Almost the same as in that
could you tell me why you divided R with 1 plus R to the n?
Yeah, it's occurring in year end. So that future payment, it's $1,000 then, but what is it to us now? It's 10 years out, so we have to discount it according to the, So this polynomial term, we're going to multiply it by one minus a over itself. And like we talked about last week, this upper expression here is all going to collapse into a minus a to the n plus 1. So we can make a reverse substitution, and it turns into every algebra student's worst nightmare. What do we have? 1 over 1 plus r minus 1 over 1 plus r to the n plus 1. And then rearranging terms here, we can multiply it through by 1 plus r to the n plus 1, right? Multiply each term by 1 plus r to the n plus 1. And all this simplifies down. I'm going to skip 2 steps if that's okay. I'm not really here for algebra. Please, good. So rearranging, right, just multiply through by 1 plus r to the n. We get 1 over r minus 1 over r times 1 plus r to the n. Plus par, 1 plus r, that's the n. And this is exactly equal to the price that we would pay if we wanted to lock in that hurdle rate R.
Is this equating our hurdle rate with the coupon?
It's not. Yeah, the
Okay, so
coupon,
how does the coupon now matter then?
well, it does matter. So this is where it matters, is that this I
Uh-huh.
equals the coupon rate
Oh, there, okay, yes.
times
Yeah.
R. Yeah, exactly. Good question. So that tells us exactly what price to pay. If we have a hurdle rate R, remember that this is something according to each investor. I may have a higher hurdle rate than Lauren, who may have a higher hurdle rate than Jim. We've got, every investor has a different hurdle rate. You set that and you say, based on this hurdle rate, what price should I pay, right? So here's your hurdle rate. You take that future stream of payments, discount it according to your hurdle rate. That's your price that you should pay, right? And so this represents, just sort of a simplified version of that net present value calculation. This represents the end interest payments, and this represents the par payment that you get at the end of the contract of the bond, right? So, it's a relatively straightforward equation to use. We'll go over one example. So let's suppose we've got a 10-year bond at a 7% coupon and a $1,000 par value. Then we want to know what price should we pay. If we have a 9% hurdle rate. So we've got our price equation. Interest payment, 1 over the hurdle rate.
The interest is the amount of the payment though, it's not the rate of the coupon. You have to
correct.
calculate what is 7% of 1,000
Exactly.
to substitute for that.
Okay, since it already
Yep, that's right. So the coupon rate is 7%. Par value is 1,000, so $70 interest payment. We're going to get that annually. Our hurdle rate is 9%. Oops, that's right. And par value is 1,000. And so if you have a 9% hurdle rate, you'll wait until the price drops to $871.65 before you actually buy that bond. So I believe, Ben, last week you mentioned something like, well, in obtaining an interest rate, it's not like we have a choice over interest rates, right? And in some sense it kind of is, right? Where these prices are fluctuating all around. And so if it reaches a certain price, it will actually reach the hurdle rate that you desire. And so, yeah, you just kind of got to sit on your hands until you actually get the price that gives you the hurdle rate that you want. Yeah.
So is this basically how they calculate, let's say you want to buy municipal bond, based on the same calculation?
Yep. So let's take a look at this diagram, because this is sort of the general philosophy behind pricing these future streams, is that you've got these future payments, and each one basically contributes a different amount towards the overall value of the bond, right? So in this case, the hurdle rate is exactly 10% and the coupon rate is 10%. So the arithmetic works out to where the present value is actually equal to the market value in this case. So they've got hurdle rate equals 10% and the coupon is 10%. And so in this case, it all works out nicely. Anyway, so the point I'm getting across here is that these future payments, they all contribute a little bit to the overall value of the bond. So this $100 to me a year from now is worth $90.91 to me today. $100 2 years from now is worth $82.64 to me today, right? You discount all these values back to the present, and then when you add them up, that gives you the net present value of that future stream of cash flows. And so that is the price that you would pay for that bond, assuming that you have that particular yield in mind. Okay, so it's a real nice diagram that sort of illustrates that. The source of value in this bond is each of those future payments. So any questions before we go on? All right. So let's take a look at yield to maturity. So I wanted to go through this relatively quickly, so I just wrote it up on a document. We can just sort of breeze through it a little bit, just to sort of at least talk about it. But we've got other things to do today. It's interesting, but not really the main focus for tonight. So yield to maturity, we've already talked about it. You get a positive yield from the interest payments. That's always going to be positive. But then, if you're buying a $1,000 par value bond, then you know you're getting $1,000 at the end of the term of the bond, right? But you buy it at various prices. So what happens is you get some yield due to the gains or losses as the bond is paid back. Positive if you bought below par value, and you get a negative contribution to yield if you bought above par value, right? And so, just working through a quick example here, suppose a 1-year $1,000 par value bond has a coupon of 8%. And suppose you can buy it for $800. Then what you'll notice is, okay, we've got the same pricing equation. Price equals I times whatever R minus, or R1 plus R to the n, plus par over 1 plus R to the n. So that same pricing equation, but we've just plugged in n is 1, coupon is 8% of 1,000, and the price is 1,000. So we plugged those in. Now we need to solve for the yield. So this is the yield to maturity right here. And in this very special example, we can actually solve it algebraically. We just, clear denominators, rearrange some stuff, and then we get R equal to 280 over 800, which it's better to think of it this way: 200 plus 80 over 800, right? So what this represents is you've got $200 in gains from your 800 that you paid to the $1,000 that you get back, and you also get $80 in gains from the interest that you're making, right?
That should increase if you would get more years in.
That's right. That's right. So what we have then is, in this very special case for a 1-year bond, we have this equation right here. The interest that we make plus the difference between the par value and the price that we paid. Right, divided by the price we paid. And so for longer durations, it's a similar idea, right? We pay a certain price. We don't know what the yield necessarily is when we pay that price. So we can rearrange some stuff and we get this equation here. but this thing can't be solved in closed form. And so there's a numerical recipe that you can cook up to actually solve for R numerically. And so Mr. De Leon in the back there actually wrote up some code last week for our project. And he just finished it. He nailed down all the last little details today on this code that solves for R numerically. So nice work, Matt. And but it's the same general philosophy that you've got gains from interest and you've got gains from the change in the value of the bond when it's reduced at par. And those are the two contributing factors that give you the overall yield to maturity. And so yeah, so that's just this comment here. The process for solving R aside, the intuition for what R represents is the same as in the simple case. Gains from future interest payments and gains or losses from the bond being paid back in par. So here's sort of the critical idea that is sort of central to pricing theory in general. You'll note that the yield to maturity is simply the hurdle rate in the bond pricing equation, right? And so this is the general interpretation. Assuming that markets are efficient, meaning they price things at the correct value, what price represents is a summary value that describes the overall market's assessment of the hurdle rate required for this company to offer this debt. So there's a lot of information packed into this yield to maturity measurement, right? A summary value which describes the overall market's assessment of the hurdle rate required for this company to offer this debt. If it was not the correct yield to charge for this company, an arbitrage opportunity would arise, which would provide investors the opportunity for risk-free profits in excess of the risk-free rate, which is assumed to never happen. So basically, if the price is not correct for this bond, someone's going to realize that at some point. They're going to buy until the price reaches the correct price. What that means, though, is that they locked in a risk-free profit. And under most models in finance, they operate under an assumption of efficient markets that say there's no such thing as a free lunch. There's no arbitrage opportunities, right? And so there's a long footnote here about the notion of efficiency, the notion of correct prices, the notion of arbitrage, and you're welcome to read through this. I spent a lot of time on this footnote. We don't have time to go into it today, but I encourage you guys to read that and ask me any questions that you have, and that's actually what the model that me and the team here are working on is trying to identify cases of inefficiency that would sort of go against this assumption that people have not efficient markets. So anyway, so that's it for bond pricing. The main reason that I wanted to talk about bond pricing is actually this diagram here that says the value of an investment can be thought of as a sum of incremental values. So in this case, we're looking at $100 per year and $1,000 after 15 years. And the price is, a sum of all those future values. And that's a very typical type of way of thinking
Is
about
the diagram wrong?
Yeah, it's on page 165 of this reading here. So see this chapter 5 here?
Yeah.
Then it's on page 165 of that for 230. Yeah, you're in the right section. So it's 165.
I'll find it.
All right. So moving on, we need to review probability. And so I've written up some notes here that will, it's a very streamlined set of notes that take you through what we'll need for this project. So a probability distribution is the set of all possible outcomes and their associated probabilities. And so we've got an example economy here. Suppose an economy will experience either an economic boom, or an economic bust, or normal growth. Suppose it experiences each with the following probabilities. Economic boom, which means a gain of about 5%, occurs 20% of the time. Normal growth, around 3%, occurs 70% of the time. And an economic bust of a decline of 2% occurs 10% of the time. So in a probability distribution, you can calculate the mean of these outcomes using the value of the outcome times its associated probability, and you add all those values up. So this tells us that the average outcome in the economy is a growth of a little below 3%. Variance, which is a measure of spread, can be calculated by value minus the mean squared times the probability of that outcome. And as you can calculate that, turns out to be 0.000329. Standard deviation we know is the square root of variance. And so standard deviation of 0.018 says we wouldn't expect this economy to grow vastly above, say, 5%. We wouldn't expect it to grow vastly below 1% at all. Okay. So this definition here is pretty central because this operator gets used a lot in later topics. So for a given probability distribution, the expected value of a function is the average of the function weighted according to the probability that each outcome occurs. And we're going to build your intuition for this in the next couple of pages. Right now I'm just introducing the definitions, and we'll do some introduction later on. So the operator name is, we give it the name E, but this E doesn't mean anything unless you actually have a probability distribution associated with it. So really you could call it E sub P, for example, where P is your probability distribution. And so this, in the discrete case, we have just a discrete list of values. It says take the function value for a given outcome times the probability of that outcome and add all those up. And if you have a continuous random distribution, P of x, and you have some function of values f of x, then you're weighting the function f according to the probability that those y values occur, and you're taking the sum of all those. Okay. And so a couple of examples of the expected value function. The expected value of x is literally just the mean, right? Because the expected value of this function says multiply the value of the function times the probability that it occurs and add. And that's exactly the mean that we saw in the previous page, right? So expected value of a random variable is simply the mean of the random variable. Same thing here with variance. Variance is equal to the sum of the difference of these squares times the probability that they occur. But the mean, we already saw the last formula, is just expected value of x. And then this sum here is the expected value for the function that takes the value of the variable minus the mean of the variable squared. So this is just the expected value of this function, right? So in other words, the mean can be written in terms of the expected value. The variance can be written in terms of the expected value. And so as a quick example, here's the value of the variable. So a value of 1 occurs 5% of the time. A value of 7 occurs 94% of the time. And a value of 10 occurs 1% of the time. What is this variable doing? Most of the time it's just sitting around 7, right? 94% of the time it's landing on 7. 5% of the time, I mean 1 time out of 20, it's landing at 1. And 1% of the time it lands on 10. So the mean of this thing, it has to be relatively close to 7 because that's the value of the variable most of the time. And so sure enough, expected value for this variable, value times its associated probability, does add to a little below 7, which is exactly what we thought, right? What about the variance? Do we expect the variance to be high or low for this random variable? High variance?
Variance, if you have 94% 7, it should be low.
Yeah, it's going to be low, right? Because it's not very spread out. It lands at 7, lands at 7, lands at 7, lands at 7. Oh, it hit 1 all of a sudden. But most of the time it's just landing on 7 repeatedly. So the variance is also going to be pretty low. All right, so you can compute the variance. You get 1.8171, which is a standard deviation 1.3, which is pretty low, right? So just looking at that. So, again, building your intuition for how this operator works, we have this histogram here. And in this histogram, the height of the bar represents the probability that value will occur. So 7 occurred 94% of the time. So this bar is huge. 1 occurred 5% of the time, so that bar is pretty small. And then 10 occurred 1% of the time, so it's a tiny occurrence, right? And the mean can be thought of as the balance point. If these were masses stacked out on a scale, the mean can be thought of as the balance point for those masses. Okay. And so just like we saw, 7 dominates the behavior, so the mean, is very, very close to that 7.
I'm not sure if this belongs here, but I used to teach my students, I just connected 3 points, and it should look like a house, roof of a house roof, or
So connect the tops here.
the house. So I would see that 7 is where it's more
Sort of balanced out.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I like that. It makes it pretty easy to see. So the variance is a sum of the squared terms. So it used to be red. Now it's not. So these red boxes here, these are the squared terms that you were seeing in that formula. So in that formula we had the value minus the mean squared. So take that difference and square it, and you get the size of these boxes here, right? So those boxes are all weighted according to the probability that they occur. So this 1 has this large box associated to it, but because 1 only occurred at probability 0.05, this box, even though it's large, it actually doesn't contribute that much to the sum, right? Same thing here. This box is also pretty large, but it's weighted with a probability of 0.01. So this also doesn't contribute that much to the sum. So the main contribution to the variance is this small box here, which is weighted at a probability of 0.94. And so that's why we have such a small variance, is that the squared term that contributes most to the variance is the smallest squared, right? So that's just a little bit of probability background to help build your intuition for what that expected value operator measures. Are there any questions on the expected value? Think of it just as an average of y values, where the y values that you're taking the average of are whatever's plugged into the e, right? E of f of x. And these y values are weighted according to a probability distribution. Okay, we're taking that first. So, now that we have this expected value operation in hand, we're going to build a binomial tree model. And these binomial tree models, there's just oodles and oodles of content out there if you want to read more about them. We're using this binomial tree model as a way to give you a sense of a very important definition. Which is what's called risk-neutral probability. Yes. Oh, yeah. And so binomial tree models, it's a whole branch of math, really. It's, stochastic calculus. So if you want to read more about them, there's, a lot out there. We need to introduce a little bit of notation. And so S of n is going to be the price of an asset at time n. And the idea behind the S value is that we're thinking of it as a stock. So price of the stock at time n. So S of 0 is the starting price. K then is the percentage return from the previous step. So the percentage change in price from the previous step.
Meaning from time n-1?
That's right. Yep. And we're going to assume that, again, this is a binomial model, so we're going to assume that K can either be an upper value or a lower value. So in our model, we have an upper percentage and a lower percentage. And it's not that D necessarily means negative. It could be a negative return. It just means D as in downer. The upper return and the downer return. So this could be 5%, this could be 3%, right? And we're going to assume that this occurs with probability P. The upper return occurs with probability P. And the lesser return occurs with probability 1 minus P.
So it's either one or the other.
Yep, that's where the binary element comes in. Yep. And there's, a whole bunch of generalizations of this. And in the reader, there's actually a trinomial model. All right, so what we're going to assume is that we have the same U and D at every time step.
Would there be a binomial model then, if you have done the same? You have the same value?
This is a binomial model. Yeah, so binomial just meaning two possible outcomes.
But the outcomes that's, oh, yeah, okay.
I come to coin toss.
Yeah. So also going to assume that periods are independent. Meaning, if the previous return was an increase, it doesn't affect the likelihood that the next one's going to be an increase. It's the same probabilities for each time step. It's all independent. And so to move between times, we have an initial value of the stock of S of 0. And the value of S of 1 is going to be the initial price times 1 plus K of 1. So whatever this random variable happened to be, if it was the higher return, then S of 0 would get multiplied by that higher return to give you a higher value for time step 1. And if it was the lesser return, 1 plus that lesser return, that does not give you the lesser return. Okay, so questions on this equation? Okay, same thing here. S of 2 is S of 1 times 1 plus K of 2. And so on and so forth.
Because they're independent, it doesn't refer back to S of 0. It doesn't matter what S of 0 was at all.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, you could recreate it if you wanted to.
So what we notice is, okay, we're really just building incrementally by multiplying by some return, right? If K1 was 5%, then we constructed something that's 5% higher than it was initially. And then if the next one is also 5%, then this one's going to be 5% above this. And so we're just sort of building this one step at a time. And so we notice that really we can sort of cut out a bunch of those in-between steps. And we get, for example, S of 3 is equal to S of 0 times 1 plus K of 1. Return on the next step, and the return on the next step.
What's the first S what after equal sign?
Yeah, S of 0,
S, oh, yeah.
the value of the stock at time 0. And so just keep in mind, this is not a deterministic function, right? You don't plug in a value and have it output a value. It's a stochastic variable. It bounces all around, right? So if you wanted to, quote unquote, compute the value of this function, what you'd have to do really is you'd have to compute a tree, right? So we've got S of 0. And with probability P, it's going to follow the upper return to give us S of 0 times 1 plus U. And with probability 1 minus P, it'll return the lower of the two returns, 1 plus D. Same thing here. This is independent, so the fact that we had a high return on the previous doesn't change the probabilities of what's going to happen on this step, right? So with probability P, it'll return S of 0 times 1 plus U times 1 plus U, right? This is from the previous step, and this is from this step. And with probability 1 minus P, it'll return S of 0 times 1 plus u, that's from the previous step,
1 plus d.
and 1 plus d on this step, exactly. So we went up on the first step, and we have the lesser return on the second step. Same thing here. We could have S of 0 times 1 plus d times 1 plus d. The lesser return the first time, the lesser return the second time. And that occurs with probability 1 minus p. Or we could have, from the 1 plus d return, it could return 1 plus u on the next step. And that occurs with probability p. So questions so far on what we're constructing here?
What does it all mean?
So
I didn't know
This
this.
narrow
I don't know.
We're trying to find the outcomes, there are many of them.
right,
You get to it more as you go on.
exactly, yeah. So what you'll notice is that these don't all occur with the same frequency, right? What you want to do is you want to count how many ways can you land on a given outcome. So for this outcome here, there's only one way to land on it. You go up on the first step, up on the next step. So there's one way to get here.
1, 2, 1.
Exactly, yeah. So this way, there's one way going up and then going down, or you can go down and go up. So there's two ways to get there. And then this way, you have to go down first and down on the second. So the same idea applies if you have a three-step tree. Oops, sorry. So there's a three-step tree. Then on this upper branch, there's only one way to land.
1, 3, 3, 1.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, so this one we've got up, down, up, or we've got up, up, down, or we've got down, up, up. Yeah, exactly. So we've got down, down, up, down, up, down, up, down, down.
Up, down, down. Down, down, down.
Yeah, so just like you guys are noticing, these are really just the choose function, right? We've got 3 entries in each of these, and we're choosing a certain number of them to be ups, right? So in this case, we've got 3 entries, and we're choosing all 3 of them to be up. That occurs one way, right? This next one, we've got 3 entries, we're choosing 2 of them to be up. That occurs 3 ways. Here we've got 3 entries, we're choosing 1 of them to be up. That occurs 3 ways. And here we're choosing 0 of them to be up. And that occurs 1 way. Okay. So questions so far on this binomial tree? I do have a calculation. I think you guys are probably okay. So I think we'll skip it because we're running out of time. And so let's go ahead and take a look at the expected value of this variable over time. So again, expected value, you just want to think average of some function. So we've got, what is the expected value of the stock price at time n? So this is our function, right? These function values are getting weighted according to the probability that they occur. And we're taking the average of all those weighted function. Okay. So, just as we saw before, S of n is really equal to the initial price times 1 plus the first return, 1 plus the second return, and so on and so forth, all the way up to the end, the return for the nth step. And so this expected value operator has all kinds of nice identities that it follows, and in the beginning of the reader, if you want to brush up on some of those identities, I gave a whole bunch of those for various readings. So there's a whole bunch of identities you can use. In particular, it ignores constant multiples. And all of these variables are independent from one another. And for expected value, if you have independent random variables, you get to just multiply the expected value of each of them. Okay, distributes over sums. And again, another identity is that the expected value of a constant is just itself. So we distribute this over the sum, we get 1 plus expected value of the first return. One plus the expected value of the second return. And so on. Okay, but recall that these things are independent. These k of 1, k of 2, k of 3, they all give you the same probabilities, right? The probability of having the higher return was p, and the probability of having the lesser return was d. So each of these expected values are actually just going to give you the same thing. And so we can rewrite this as 1 plus expected value of the first return. And we've got n copies of this. So that's the expected value of the stock price at time n under this binomial model. And so, I wish I could say a little bit more about this. Again, we're running short on time, so I think I'm going to move on. I do have one quick example that will illustrate it pretty well, actually. So let's suppose that we have that the upper return is 5%, the lesser return is 0.03, and suppose that this occurs with probability 0.8, and this occurs with probability 0.2. Then the expected value of the stock at time 3 says multiply the initial price. Oh, sorry, the initial price is 100. Multiply that initial price by 1 plus the one-step return. The expected value for the one-step return. So The expected value for the one-step return turns out to be 4.6%. And so you multiply that up, you get 114.44. And so what this says, it says, take your typical binomial tree model. You're going to bounce around in the tree over the course of 3 steps, right? Higher, lower, higher, lower. And each time you run this binomial tree model 3 steps, you're going to land in a different place. Sometimes you'll get 3 higher returns in a row. Sometimes you get 3 of the lower returns in a row. A lot of times you'll be in the middle, right? So what this does, it says, on average, if you just play this game over and over again, then you can expect that your investment, on average, after 3 steps, is going to be $114.44. So we're now going to define risk neutral probability. So we're going to assume a risk-free return, which we'll call R, is available. So you can invest your money in a bank account, invest your money in a government bond, something where you know you're going to get your money at the given time period. Then it can be assumed that the lesser return D is less than the risk-free rate, and the risk-free rate is less than the upper return. This is a relatively safe assumption because if the lesser return for this investment was above the risk-free rate, you wouldn't invest in the risk-free asset, you'd invest in the other asset, because the lesser return for that asset is above the risk-free rate. So that's, giving you basically a new risk-free rate. D would be the new risk-free rate, right? So that's not going to happen. So you've got the lesser return must be less than the risk-free rate. The upper return, if it was less than the risk-free rate, no one would invest in that company because they can just invest in the risk-free rate. So this is a relatively safe assumption under, just sort of general common sense. And we want to ask, if an investment satisfies the return at time step 1 could be a higher rate U or a lower rate D, what probability must U and D be to give us an average return equal to the risk-free rate? Probability weighting between the higher return and the lower return which you need to make sure that you got, on average, the risk-free rate. And so we'll associate P star with the upper value, and we'll associate 1 minus P star with the lower value. And after that, it becomes a relatively straightforward equation. Expected value of a variable just says multiply the value of that variable times its probability and add. I want this to equal the risk-free rate. And so some simple algebra, which I'm highly confident everyone in this room could master. You just solve for P star, you get R minus D over U minus D. And that is the risk-neutral probability. And I've spent pretty much a whole year trying to internalize exactly what risk-neutral means. And it's a very, very subtle concept that has a lot of implications in asset pricing. And it's, if you have a risk-neutral investor is someone who, if they can get a guaranteed rate R, or a not guaranteed, if they can get a guaranteed R or a guaranteed average R, then they're fine either way, right? So if I say, I'll give you $1 every year guaranteed, or I'll give you $0 if I get a heads, and $2 if I get a tails, then a risk-neutral investor says, well, if you just do this infinitely many times, I come out pretty much the same either way, because I'll get $0 one year, $2 the next year, and they'll average each other out. So if you're risk-neutral, then you just don't care whether you get a guaranteed R or an average R, right? And so risk neutrality has all kinds of implications, later pricing theory, which I'm still struggling with myself, but we're going to use risk neutrality in our pricing model. And so, yeah, actually I have a class in 2 minutes, so I got to kind of bolt, but are there any last minute questions? So the reading for this week, I've posted it on the Mostra website, but you can read through this bond chapter here just for fun. There's no problems or anything you need to do, but just if you want to learn more about bonds, then you can read through that bond chapter. The main reading is chapter 3 in this Mathematics for Finance. So chapter 3.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Do you want to collect this tax form thing?
Yes, yeah, so if you have your,
You just need 2 sheets, right?
that's right, yeah, it should be a tax form and the non-service step.
Sorry, what was the reading again?
The reading was the bond
Bonds and
chapter.
math for financing.
Yeah, chapter 3. And I'll post that on Mostra as soon as I've done the class.
Okay. Oh, so the reading will be posted on.
Okay, thank you, Ryan.
Yeah. All right, thank you guys. Thanks so much for coming.
Before everybody runs this, I tried to mention this, I'd like to see anybody's questions, which example.